Well, it's Groundhog Day. Again. And that must mean that I am Professor Robert E. G. Black, and this is the Groundhog Day Project.
It's like we're stuck. You know, like a needle on a scratch record.
It's one of those infinite time loop situations you might have heard about.
It's a thing where the same day keeps happening?
I wake up every day right here, right in Punxsutawney, and it's always February 2nd.
Time. I promise to explain everything later, but I need you to trust me.
Slow down! What are you, in a damn time loop or something?
That's a courthouse where a very famous case was tried. There's a jail attached to it, the lighter-colored building. Yeah. Eugene Debs, father of American socialism, was tried there and defended by Clarence Darrow.
Bill Roberts, socialistworker.org, 20th July, 2007. Quote, every child in the U.S. is taught that Abraham Lincoln of Illinois freed the slaves. But few learn that Eugene Victor Debs of Indiana devoted his life to ending wage slavery. Some of Debs' contemporary admirers compared him to Lincoln. After seeing Debs speak to a capacity crowd in 1894, John Swinton wrote in his weekly paper, as Lincoln of Illinois became an efficient agent of freedom, so perchance might Debs of Indiana become in the impending conflict for the liberation of labor. This observation followed the Great Strike against the Pullman sleeping car company that year, which brought Debs to national attention in the labor movement and set him on the road to socialism. Born on November 5th, 1855, Debs' life began in the period just before the Civil War began. He died October 20th, 1926, after the end of the First World War. The period between the two wars was full of immense tumult, and Debs played an important role in helping to shape the class struggle and the politics that emerged. He himself was transformed so that he would acknowledge, from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet, I am a Bolshevik and proud of it. End quote. Jill Lepore, The New Yorker, 11th February 2019. Quote, Eugene Victor Debs left school at the age of 14 to scrape paint and grease off the cars of the Vandalia Railroad in Indiana for 50 cents a day. He got a raise when he was promoted to fireman, which meant working in the locomotive next to the engineer, shoveling coal into a firebox, as much as 2 tons an hour, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Firemen, caked in coal dust, blinded by wind and smoke, had to make sure the engine didn't explode, an eventuality they weren't always able to forestall. If they were lucky and lived long enough, firemen usually became engineers, which was safer than being a switchman or a brakeman, jobs that involve working on the tracks next to a moving train, or racing across its top in any weather at the risk of toppling off and getting run over. All these men reported to the conductors, who had the top job, and on trains owned by George Mortimer Pullman, one of the richest men in the United States. All of them, the engineers, the firemen, the brakemen, the switchmen, and even the scrapers, outranked the porters. Pullman porters were almost always black men and ex-slaves, and, at the start, were paid nothing except the tips they could earn by bowing before the fancy passengers who could afford the sleeping car, and who liked very much to be served with a shuffle and a grin, Dixie style. Every man who worked on the American Railroad in the last decades of the 19th century became, of necessity, a scholar of the relations between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, the masters and the slaves, the riders and the ridden upon. No student of this subject is more important to American history than Debs, half man, half myth, who founded the American Railway Union, turned that into the Social Democratic Party, and ran for President of the United States 5 times, including once from prison. End quote. Francis Fox Piven and Richard A. Cloward, Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed, How They Fail. Quote, Some of the bitterest examples of the use of force by government against strikers occurred during the severe depressions of the late 19th century when unemployment and wage cuts made people desperate, and the scale of the calamity forged a unity among workers, which led to epidemics of protests. In 1877, when 4 years of severe depression had led to sharp wage cuts and left perhaps 1 million industrial workers unemployed, a strike on the Pennsylvania and Baltimore and Ohio railroads led to riots that swept through a dozen major rail centers, escalating to open conflict between workers and troops. When local police and state militia were unable to handle the disturbances in Pittsburgh, for example, police and militia were openly sympathetic with the mob that was burning railroad property to the ground. 3,000 federal troops were rushed from city to city under the direction of the War Department. Order was finally restored, leaving 26 dead in Pittsburgh, where the mob openly resisted, 13 dead and 43 wounded in Reading, Pennsylvania, 19 dead and more than 100 wounded in Chicago. Property damage reached about $5 million. It was subsequent to these upheavals that huge National Guard armories were constructed in the heart of America's big cities. A decade later, a new depression triggered another, even greater uprising of workers, and again the strikes were broken with the aid of police and militia, justified this time by the Haymarket bombing incident. Interrupting the quote because actually I've never studied in much detail the Pullman strikes. I know it came up, but that just mentioned the Haymarket bombing, and that I did write about in, it's not my published paper, I have a published paper on the Weather Underground. What is the published one called? I wrote like 3 very lengthy papers as a history major about 60s radicals, in particular the Weather Underground. One of the papers was published. It is called Smash Monogamy, From Sexual Revolution to Political Revolution. But the Haymarket thing did come up in my paper, Flower Children Have Grown Thorns, because one of the riots in Chicago, I want to say the Days of Rage, but it might have been the year before or after, or maybe all of those, were deliberately scheduled on the anniversary of the Haymarket bombing. And I believe the statue they supposedly blew the head off of was somehow related to the Haymarket incident, and now I am curious and I really want to go find it. And I'm going to insert it here. Formed and still forming out of the broken SDS, Weatherman began its series of bombings October 6, 1969, with a bomb placed at the feet of the Haymarket police statue in Chicago to inaugurate the Days of Rage. Weatherman took to heart, perhaps a little too at the same time, literally and figuratively, the words of Mario Savio 5 years earlier during the free speech movement in Berkeley.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Savio's version of putting bodies on the gears involved sit-ins, teach-ins, rallies. Weatherman's Days of Rage intended to demonstrate their righteous fury to a degree no demonstration had yet. SDS publication about the event was called Bring the War Home. Back to the quote. The scenario was reenacted again in the Depression of the 1890s when wage cuts and rising unemployment in manufacturing and transportation precipitated strikes involving some 750,000 workers, primarily in steel, in mining, and in the railroad industry. In Pennsylvania, the governor called out 7,000 troops to deal with the Homestead steelworkers. I think I wrote a paper on the Homestead incident. A quick excerpt from a paper entitled simply Homestead, Pennsylvania. This was for a geography class, so it was specifically about how the geography of the region led to the founding of the location of the factory on a specific location, how that also the geography led to certain kind of people living there, and eventually culminating in why that's where this particular strike happened. Here's just a paragraph about the strike itself. Quote, Spring 1892 Andrew Carnegie was summering in his homeland, Scotland, leaving Henry C. Frick in charge of his various factories, including the Homestead Works. Before new contract negotiations with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had even failed. Frick ordered fences built. Oh, that's the beginning of the sentence. Before new contract negotiations with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had even failed, Frick ordered fences built in Homestead. 2-inch thick wooden planks, 11 feet high, 3 miles long, ringing the works and down to the boat landing. These fences were strung with 3 strands of barbed wire. July 1st, after the union contract was not renewed, all entrances to the works were picketed. When sheriff's deputies came in, strikers led them peacefully away. On July 2nd, the entire force of employees at the Carnegie Mills were paid off and served with notices of discharge. And July 6th, a steamer pulling 2 barges full of Pinkerton Detective Agency's men, said to number 300, went up the river to the plant to protect any workers who sought entrance with a desire to go to work. A violent battle ensued, including the use of guns and dynamite. Killed were 3 Pinkertons and 7 workers, and 30 more were wounded. The eyes of the nation turned to this tiny factory town, the new front in the struggle between so-called captains of industry, like Carnegie, and unionized workers. July 11th, I can say that better. The new front in the struggle between so-called captains of industry like Carnegie and unionized workers. July 11th, the company regained control after 8,000 troops were ordered into Homestead by Governor Patteson. July 23rd, anarchist Alexander Berkman would try to assassinate Frick, but by then the battle was over. The Union had lost. End quote. Back to the quote. In Idaho, in the Coeur d'Alene region, National Guard and federal troops rounded up all Union miners and put them in a stockade where they were held for months without charges. The Pullman Railroad strike of 1894 brought thousands of federal troops to Chicago, with the result that an estimated 30... Because there was a weird typo here, I had to look up the numbers. Estimated deaths in Chicago were around 30. This source says 34, I think. And a historian, David Ray Pepke, estimates that another 40 were killed in other states in related incidents. So, like the Wikipedia page actually puts it at 70 as the estimate for deaths, 57 for injuries. That's a lot. But back to me trying to figure out the typo. That's a weird punctuation, that an estimated 34 people were killed, and Eugene Debs was imprisoned. Subsequently, the federal government stationed marshals in numerous railroad centers to protect railroad property, at a cost of at least $400,000. These statistics almost surely fail to suggest the true magnitude of violence by government against workers during this period. One contemporary writer, for example, estimated that in the years 1902 to 1904 alone, 198 persons were killed and 1,986 injured. Overall, Taft and Ross were able to identify 160 occasions on which state and federal troops were called out to deal with labor agitations. As Eugene Debs said after the strike by his American Railway Union was crushed by the federal government in 1894, "We have only got a number, and a limited number, of poorly paid men in our organization, and when their income ceases they are starving. We have no power of the government behind us. We have no recognized influence in society on our side. On the other side, the corporations are in perfect alliance. They have all the things that money can command, and that means a subsidized press, that they are able to control the newspapers, and means a false or vitiated public opinion. The clergy almost steadily united in thundering their denunciations. Then the courts, then the state militia, then the federal troops. Everything and all things on the side of the corporations." When the steel strike of 1919 was defeated by United States Steel, A report of the Interchurch Commission echoed the judgments of Eugene Debs 25 years earlier. The United States Steel Corporation was too big to be beaten by 300,000 working men. It had too large a cash surplus, too many allies among other businesses, too much support from government officers, local and national, too strong influence with social institutions such as the press and the pulpit. It spread over too much of the earth, still retaining absolute centralized control, to be defeated by widely scattered workers of many minds, many fears, varying states of pocketbook, and under a comparatively improvised leadership. End quote. USHistory.org, quote, making his way in the railroad industry, Debs formed the American Railway Union in 1892. 2 years later, he found himself leading one of the largest strikes in American history, the Great Pullman Strike. When its workers refused to accept a pay cut, the Pullman Car Company fired 5,000 employees. To show support, Debs called for the members of the American Railway Union to refrain from operating any trains that used Pullman cars. When the strike was declared illegal by a court injunction, chaos erupted. President Cleveland ordered federal troops to quell the strikers, and Debs was arrested. Soon, order was restored, and the strike failed. Debs was not originally a socialist, but his experience with the Pullman strike and his subsequent 6-month jail term led him to believe that drastic action was necessary. Debs chose to confine his activity to the political arena. In 1900, he ran for president as a socialist and garnered some 87,000 votes. The following year, leading sympathizers joined with him to form the Socialist Party. At its height, the party numbered over 100,000 active members. Debs ran for president 4 more times. In the election of 1912, he received over 900,000 votes. After being arrested for anti-war activities during World War I, he ran for president from his jail cell and polled 919,000 votes. Debs died in 1926, having never won an election, but over 1,000 Socialist Party members were elected to state and city governments. Eugene V. Debs, the prisoner who ran for president. Quick history, 30th May 2024.
Eugene V. Debs was convicted under the Espionage Act in 1918 for his outspoken opposition to World War I. Sentenced to 10 years in prison, he was assigned inmate number 2253 at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Despite his incarceration, Debs ran a remarkable presidential campaign from behind bars, advocating for workers' rights and social justice. The Socialist Party embraced Debs' situation, even using his convict number in their campaign buttons, stating, "Convict 2253 for President." His campaign in 1920 was unique and showed his unwavering commitment to his principles.
Sam Dresser, Aeon, 2nd October 2023. Quote, a shot rang out from the jailhouse at Woodstock, Illinois. There it is! See, we're in Woodstock. See, we looped back around, got to the connection. It's not just me promoting socialism and having a problem with corporations controlling what goes on in the world or the country, corruption of government and all that. This is me talking about Groundhog Day. It is worth mentioning, before I get into the quote, actually, that Harold Ramis mentions this.
That's a courthouse where a very famous case was tried. There's a jail attached to it, the lighter-colored building. Yeah. Eugene Debs, father of American socialism, was tried there and defended by Clarence Darrow.
Like, he doesn't have to mention what the courthouse is famous for. He just has to mention that's the courthouse and we film in there. Because the bar is in there. It's not a courthouse anymore. The bar is in there, and Phil's jail cell is in there, though not in a jail cell. It was part of the bar, if I remember right, and they put in the bars and took out a table so he could stand there. I think that comes up in the commentary, so I'll have more detail on that when we get to that minute. But that's all Ramis needed to say. But in talking about Woodstock, he mentions this. I don't think he mentions some of the more famous performances that happened at the Opera House, though I did get that from the tour, and we'll talk about it at some point. But I think it matters that Ramis brought this up. He has a reference. He's from Chicago, so Eugene Debs is probably a much bigger figure there than elsewhere in the country. In Woodstock, outside Chicago, is where he was jailed. One of the times. A shot rang out from the jailhouse at Woodstock, Illinois, on a quiet summer's morning in 1895. One of the inmates had pulled the trigger on an old Civil War musket after thrusting it between the iron bars of a window. The gun was fired by the Union leader Eugene V Debs to mark the 4th of July. This was no prison break, but a demand for another kind of freedom. Later that day, he would write in praise of liberty, while delivering the grim verdict that, in the United States, it now lies cold and stiff and dead. Soon to be the country's most influential socialist, how had Debs come to find himself contemplating the prospects of U.S. liberty from behind the bars of McHenry County Jail? Debs' story is more than mere biography. It speaks to the wider struggle of the U.S. working class, who were facing the harsh new realities of industrial capitalism. But it must be admitted that the man himself cut a striking figure, being possessed of great charisma, courage, and powers of speech. His French immigrant parents found their way from Alsace to Terre Haute, Indiana, where little Jean was born in 1855. Something of the frontier spirit still survived in the small city, which had not yet suffered the sharp class divisions that were visible elsewhere in the country. Although Debs left school at 14, heading to the railroad to scrape paint and grease for 50 cents a day, his education acquainted him with the Republican history of the U.S., which held the liberty and sovereignty of its citizens in the highest regard. Graduating from the paint shop to a job as a locomotive fireman, his mother pleaded with Debs to quit the railroads after an accident killed 2 of his colleagues. An abysmal safety record and negligible compensation for injured railwaymen were just some of the many indignities of the ruthless business practices of avaricious industrialists. Before wisely heeding his mother's warnings, Debs joined the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, subsequently rising to become its Grand Secretary and editing the widely read Fireman's Magazine for well over a decade. From his editorial perch, he could be far from militant, initially opposing strikes and delivering moralistic sermons on the Brotherhood's motto of benevolence, sobriety, and industry. His new prominence would even lead to his election as a Democratic member of the Indiana House of Representatives in the mid-1880s. But sensing the limitations of both the state legislature and the conservative craft unionism of the Brotherhood, he sought a different vehicle to advance the interests of railroad workers. What began to disturb Debs was the despotic power of corporations and the judiciously sanctioned violence that could be unleashed on workers who resisted attempts to sack them or suppress their wages. As he later remarked, their combined influence let loose deputy marshals armed with pistols and clubs and supported by troops with gleaming bayonets and shotted guns, and has vanished liberty from the land. He came to feel that citizens could no longer be counted as free when they were under the thumb of a plutocratic ruling class backed by a corrupt judiciary and the violence of hired Pinkerton strikebreakers, with helpless workers even coming to resemble slaves. That language of slavery was shocking, even hyperbolic, but it allowed Debs to associate the plight of workers with the 2 great Republican bids for emancipation in the country's history: the fight for independence against the political slavery supposedly imposed by the British, and the more recent attack on chattel slavery that had led to the Civil War. On the railroads, the insular craft unions, who organized separately according to job roles, seemed doomed to irrelevance in the face of the titans of industry. Leading the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers in the failed Burlington Railroad strike of 1888, where several workers were killed, brought home to Debs the bitter limits of this kind of organizing. So he gradually broke with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers in order to help found the American Railway Union in 1893, which aimed to unite all those who worked on the railroads, while enjoying rapid growth ahead of an early victory on the Great Northern Railroad. This set the scene for the Pullman strike that would propel Debs to national fame and put him on a collision course with the powerful coterie of economic, legal, and political elites. End quote. Back to Jill Lepore, The New Yorker, 11th February 2019. Quote, Debs, who wrote a lot about manliness, always said that the best kind of man was a sand man. Sand means grit, he wrote in 1882 in Fireman's Magazine. It means the power to hold on. When a train stalled from the steepness of the incline or the weight of the freight, railroad men poured sand on the tracks to improve the grip of the wheels. Men need sand too, Debs said. Men who have plenty of sand in their boxes never slip on the path of duty. Debs had plenty of sand in his box. He had, though, something of a morbid fear of ashes. Maybe that's a fireman's phobia, attending the engine man's idea of doom. In prison, having been sentenced brutally to 10 years of hard time at the age of 63, he had a nightmare. I was walking by the house where I was born, he wrote. The house was gone, and nothing left but ashes. Only ashes. Ashes. The question today for socialism in the United States, which appears to be stoking its engines, is whether it's got enough sand. Or whether it'll soon be ashes. Only ashes. All over again. End quote. Back to Sam Dresser. Aeon, 2nd October 2023. Quote, George Mortimer Pullman was an industrial magnate who manufactured railway sleeper carriages from his company town of Pullman on the outskirts of Chicago. He set the rents of the houses in which his workers were required to live, and imposed a strict moral code on them, including discouraging alcohol and gambling. When a nationwide financial panic hit in 1893, Pullman made dramatic cuts in wages while maintaining rents at their existing levels. Workers were squeezed dry, and they braced themselves for a desperate fight for survival. The ensuing conflict drew in the American Railway Union, which eventually called a boycott of trains that continued to carry Pullman carriages. The federal government responded by obtaining an injunction to stop strikers interfering with the railways, and specifically the free traffic of mail cars. The leaders of the American Railway Union, including Debs, did not stand down. Their fate was sealed by the Supreme Court upholding an earlier decision to jail them for contempt of court. What most outraged Debs and his fellow defendants was that no jury had convicted them of a crime. They had been incarcerated at the autocratic whim of a federal judge, with no opportunity to plead their case in front of ordinary citizens. If Debs could be locked up so easily, he reasoned that his fellow citizens were unfree too. But the courts were not the only arbitrary authority that must be fought in order to be free. The rise of an industrial capitalism in the closing decades of the 19th century created a breeding ground for unaccountable power. Waged workers, in particular, were at the mercy of their wealthy employers, who determined whether they would earn enough to house, clothe, and feed themselves and their families. Without the safety net of a welfare state, the discretion to dispense with laborers effectively gave wealthy industrialists the power to impoverish workers who demanded better conditions or were simply deemed surplus to requirements. The huge fortunes of industrial millionaires also granted sweeping political influence, whether through outright bribes or more subtle webs of influence. In mounting these criticisms, Debs took himself to be following in the footsteps of long-standing Republican tradition in the U.S., which lauded the freedom of its citizens. Yet his own path through the labor struggles of the Gilded Age would lead Debs to a more radical destination than his Republican forebears. He demanded an unequivocally socialist republic in which all could be free. End quote. This is David Strathern performing a piece of Debs' speech to the court, 18th September 1918. I think this was recorded for a documentary, but I couldn't confirm that.
I am opposing a social order in which it is possible for one man who does absolutely nothing that is useful to amass a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars, while millions of men and women who work all the days of their lives secure barely enough for a wretched existence. This order of things cannot always endure. I have registered my protest against it. I recognize the feebleness of my effort, but fortunately, I am not alone. There are multiplied thousands of others who, like myself, have come to realize that before we may truly enjoy the blessings of civilized life, we must organize and reorganize society upon a mutual and cooperative basis. I never so clearly comprehended as now the great struggle between the powers of greed and exploitation on the one hand, and upon the other, the rising hosts of industrial freedom and social justice. I can see the dawn of the better day for humanity. The people are awakening. In due time, they will and must come to their own.
Eugene V Debs, 16th June 1918. Quote, I realize that in speaking to you this afternoon there are certain limitations placed upon the right of free speech. I must be exceedingly careful, prudent, as to what I say, and even more careful and prudent as to how I say it. I may not be able to say all I think, but I am not going to say anything that I do not think. I would rather 1,000 times be a free soul in jail than to be a sycophant and coward in the streets. They may put those boys in jail, and some of the rest of us in jail, but they cannot put the socialist movement in jail. Those prison bars separate their bodies from ours, but their souls are here this afternoon. They are simply paying the penalty that all men have paid in all the ages of history for standing erect, and for seeking to pave the way to better conditions for mankind. End quote. Debs would be found guilty of 10 counts under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and would be sentenced to 10 years. Oxfam's Inequality, Inc. Executive Summary, January 2024. Quote, since 2020, the richest 5 men in the world have doubled their fortunes. During the same period, almost 5 billion people globally have become poorer. Hardship and hunger are a daily reality for many people worldwide. At current rates, it will take 230 years to end poverty, but we could have our first trillionaire in 10 years. A huge concentration of global corporate and monopoly power is exacerbating inequality economy-wide. 7 out of 10 of the world's biggest corporates have either a billionaire CEO or a billionaire as their principal shareholder. Through squeezing workers, dodging tax, privatizing the state, and spurring climate breakdown, corporations are driving inequality and acting in the service of delivering ever greater wealth to their rich owners. To end extreme inequality, governments must radically redistribute the power of billionaires and corporations back to ordinary people. For most people around the world, the start of this decade has been incredibly hard. At the time of writing, 4.8 billion people are poorer than they were in 2019. For the poorest people, who are more likely to be women, racialized peoples, and marginalized groups in every society, daily life has become more brutal still. Global inequality, the gap between global north and global south, has grown for the first time in 25 years. Prices are outpacing pay the world over, with hundreds of millions of people seeing their wages buy less each month, and their prospects of a better future disappear. Climate breakdown, driven by the super rich, is dramatically increasing global inequality. Protests and strikes by workers have repeatedly made the news headlines and filled the front pages. End quote. And I guess we'll leave it at that.
You were gonna say that.
This has been a production of Lemming Drops Studio. You can find links to more at lemmingdrops.com or join the Facebook group Lemming Drops Studio Tour. Also, you can support all my shows at patreon.com/lemmingdrops.
What is wrong in the end which never comes? Or which comes again and again, laughing, like waves.
Since the Big Bang set everything in motion, everything that happens in this universe has to be the way it is. Particles unfolding the way they're destined to.
How do you sleep at night? You've never seen Groundhog Day?
Yeah, you know Groundhog Day is not a documentary.
Remember when Groundhog Day was just a movie?